My name is Suzanne Mex. I'm the Managing Director for AIA New York Chapter, and we're really pleased to have this opportunity to present a program which has grown out of our own institutional magazine, the committee and editorial group that helps to put it together. The magazine is Oculus. There are extra copies on the side, and you can feel free to take one home with you tonight, though if you're a member anywhere in AIA New York State, you should be getting a copy mailed to you as well. We really are excited to have this opportunity. The magazine has been in existence for almost 100 years now, and really has been, we hope that our conversation today will show how architectural criticism has been evolving, how it's somewhat been reflected in our magazine and so many other institutions throughout the city. So with that, I will introduce Jennifer Krischel, who's the current editor-in-chief of the magazine, and she will introduce you to our panelists for tonight's program. Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone for being here. I'm just curious, who is an architect here? And okay, and then who's a writer or any sort of media? Okay, interesting. Okay, just wanted to establish our crowd a little bit. I'm a writer, not so much a speaker, so I asked for an AI-generated joke to start the evening with. So I know it's an old party trick at this point, but the joke is, and I'm going to repeat it because I think it's interesting, architecture critics have the power to shape public opinion, challenge bad design, and occasionally write something so scathing that an architect's ego needs its own structural support system. So, so I think this is interesting because it speaks to sort of this old, perhaps outmoded idea of architectural criticism and this sort of top-down, like, critic typing something that's really going to sway architecture one way or another. I don't think anyone here sees themselves in opposition to architects at this time. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like we've moved past that to some extent. We see ourselves as very much a part of the building community, ecosystem. We're all aware of the forces that professionals are up against within the city as they're working. So we're here to sort of pull back the curtain a bit on the current conversations around architecture and criticism with this group of writers, editors, and educators, who I will introduce in just a moment. The idea for this event, as Suzanne said, came sort of out of developing this most recent issue on communication within architecture. I hope you can all pick up an extra issue to give to a friend. We have a feature on how architects are communicating with the communities affected by their buildings in different ways, namely collecting and gathering information and being the recipients of different forms of communication versus just disseminating information or facts to a community. We have a second feature on internal communication styles within firms and sort of how those are evolving to be less hierarchical and take a lot of employees' input into consideration in the operation of firms. And then we have a third feature about architects who podcast and just the breadth and depth of topics they're able to get into with that format. So we also wanted to look at the evolving role of media within architecture, and that led to tonight's topic. So we have with me just quick introductions. Molly Heinz, the program chair of the SBA MA Design Research Program and the editor-at-large of Architectural Record. We have Sakjong Hung, the editor of Curbed, the city site of New York Magazine, and Sammy Medina, the editor of New York Review of Architecture, which is an independent print magazine that reviews architecture in New York, and Philip Poon, an architect, artist, and writer who is in the current cohort of the New City Critics Fellowship within the Urban Design Forum. So thank you all for being here. I wanted to just begin with each of our panelists sharing their own definitions of criticism, and it's just establishing sort of the premise of the talk, and just how they're working with criticism within their current work. So Molly, I'll throw it to you as an educator.
Right. Thank you, and thank you for organizing this and for having all of us here tonight. Good to be back at the center. I will be wearing primarily my SVA design, research, writing, and criticism hat this evening, and speaking as an educator. Although, as Jennifer said, I also function professionally as an editor. But at SVA in our program, which we have nicknamed DCRIT, we do think a lot about the practice of criticism, but we kind of do that in an active way by just plunging right in and writing. So we take the students on a really intense journey. Our full-time program is an intensive 9 months MA, and we really focus on what I would call the foundations of criticism. That's research, and in our case, writing. And so, what does that mean? Research, for criticism to be successful, you have to be credible, right? And to be credible, you have to have done your homework. And so, we work with the students on, thinking about like what that means in the context of writing about architecture. Is that a site visit? Is that kind of firsthand observation? Is it interviewing people? Is it doing a visit to archives? Is it historical research? Is it reading secondary literature? So it can be some of that, all of that, depending on your project. And so you also need to really have a firsthand understanding of who is involved in a project that you might be writing about, and then what the kind of basic decision points are for the project, and in part so you can like really think about who's accountable when. But that's really only step one, that kind of reporting style research that we do. Next, you review the evidence, and you start to develop your own original analysis. And but that's great, but then you have to convey it, and that we do through writing primarily, but it can actually happen in a variety of ways through a variety of media. But you have to do it in a compelling and persuasive way, because you want the reader to stay with you, and you want the reader to follow your argument and hopefully be persuaded, and maybe even be enlightened, and see things in a new way, perhaps. So that's what we would describe as kind of the process of criticism, making criticism. But there's also the content, of course. And so what is that? Our take on the content is really I think a more kind of expansive approach, an expansive definition of criticism that is really about cultural criticism, than kind of thinking about criticism as something like really specific, like writing a review or kind of a specific assignment. So we root it in critical thinking, and it's really about putting the subject in a much bigger context to help make sense of it, and then the key part is really answering the question of why this matters and why the reader should care. So in other words, like, what are the stakes in this situation? And so if you can answer those questions, I think you're performing criticism. So I will pause there, and I'll pass the mic to you, Sukyo.
Hi everyone, I'm Seokjung Hong. I'm here kind of wearing two hats, one as the editor of Curbed, and one as an advisory board member for the New City Critics, which I've worked on for 2 cycles. And I guess my primary relationship to criticism has been as an editor. I did study architecture, and I remember the key moment when, after like lecture 2, I began to walk around campus, and I remember everything that was built, like every building suddenly felt alive. And I realized for the first time, like at 18 years old, I was like, oh, this is all made by someone. And I think even though that was such a very like basic, rudimentary realization, I think that the criticism that we try to publish in New York Mag and Curbed, we're looking for that level of like insight, some kind of transformation in the way people understand what has always been a backdrop for them. One thing that I definitely feel at Curb New York Mag is, we're writing for a general interest audience. We do have the privilege of having a full-time architecture critic on staff, but we're always looking for pitches and always looking for new writers and things that, that should be, I guess, noticed or called out or identified that aren't about single objects or buildings or streets. And so I think the one key lens that I think we do look for in the writing that we publish, or the criticism we publish, is that it really has a really clear-eyed perspective on power. So, architects don't have that much power, to be very honest, within the built environment and the systems around it, but I think they work within these constraints, and so we really try to make sure that writers are not simply parroting what the architects and developers say their work is about. We really try to understand like the context and history, as you were saying, doing the research for where a project has come from. We're very skeptical of, the hero architect or, the artist architect, and so as much as possible, we try to provide that level of context and analysis. And then I think I had one, I wanted to show the one slide, or
I don't
the
have a
couple
clicker.
slides.
If we could go to the first slide, the first 2 slides. We can keep
And
talking.
if it doesn't, it's
I
okay,
think
I'll
it'll
describe
get
it.
there.
One quick thing that I did want to share was in terms of the criticism that we try to publish on site, there is also something that we really love to do once in a while that I feel like is more generative, which is when our architecture critic engages architects to look at a problem and actually try to, okay, yes. So this was a project we called Perfecting the New York City Street. Took a strip of 3rd Avenue, looking at the post-pandemic street and how it was, just basically a war zone of different uses and interests and programs. And if you click to the next slide, had a lot of architects, including WXY and Marvel and Brand Hadford and others, propose systems and solutions for that block. And for me, the way that we approach this project is it's basically illuminating the processes that make the street seem either like it's fixed in stone or that it actually can be changed. And so these are the types of projects that are, we can't do all the time, but that we love to do because they do clarify how everything gets made. And I think I'll stop there.
Hi, I'm Samuel Medina. I'm the editor of New York Review of Architecture, as Jennifer was saying, an independent publication that reviews architecture in New York. I have a background in trade publishing. I was at Metropolis Magazine, Fasco Design, the Architect's newspaper, and I see familiar faces from of former colleagues and associates in the audience. I think additionally to that, I was moonlighting for a period right before the pandemic of editing manuscripts for Michael Sorkin's urban research imprint. So that's a little bit about my background, which is just to tee up, I guess, about New York Review of Architecture, or NYRA, and the critical practices that it supports. I think it's pretty varied. I think criticism is kind of, generally speaking, in abstract terms. Criticism is, I guess, a means of orienting oneself to the world, and how, struggling with that at every turn. I'll use a, a word that's maybe alienating, but negativity, I think, it allows one, at least initially, to get traction on the world. And I think that's something not to be avoided, is particularly in a trade context. That's it's really difficult to kind of live out or practice a form of criticism that doesn't lean into publicity, or doesn't have one foot in publicity and one foot out. So on my end, when I took over NYRA a couple years ago, it was important for me to kind of totally excise ourselves from the PR firm nexus. Not to say I'm still on everyone's PR list, and I get all the releases, but it's very important to me that we kind of put and maintain some distance between ourselves and practitioners and publicists, and that's idealistic in a way that it's a goal, it's an aim rather than something that happens and can be achieved on a regular basis. But I think for me, it does orientate myself and our work. I'll get to the, I'm sure we'll talk about all of our respective publications in more detail soon, but I think one of the things that I find exciting about NYRA is that, unlike in previous positions I've held, I feel empowered to reach out to writers who I really respect, whether they are in architecture or not, and kind of holding their hand along the process and kind of embolden them to make sharp criticisms and observations about, our built surroundings that we all share. And I think mixing that up with people who are architecture critics for a living, which is increasingly rare, having a kind of, we recently, for example, we recently launched a column called Arc Forum, and I feel like if we had an alternative name, that's what it would be. So the general thesis of that, kind of bringing in multiple perspectives and critical practices and having them engage with one another, I think is really important for us.
Hi everyone, I'm Philip. I am not an editor, so I'm just so honored to be on this panel with such great editors at such important publications. I am a registered architect, and that's kind of been my path to criticism, in that I think maybe more broadly one can see architecture as criticism, architects criticizing other architects in a generous way through their projects, maybe in an art historical way. But maybe more personally, it's been, I've been grateful to use writing to actualize architectural ideas about people, about space, and rather than kind of wait for a commission, which is very difficult to get, writing and publishing is a way to realize something that involves criticism about the built environment, criticism about the way we use space, and to actualize those in the form of a book or an essay has been really great.
Thank you all. I think that's, Philip, what you're saying is sort of gets into one thing I think we are all looking at in our work and our public engagement, which is ideas surrounding equity and representation and sort of the pipeline that feeds into our professions. So Seok-Jung, I was wondering maybe you could kick off talking about working with New City Critics and on this innovative fellowship program, and sort of from your point of view on the board, and then Philip could share his side of that specific experience. Thanks.
Yeah, so some of you may be familiar, but New City Critics, which is now kind of working with its second cohort, It's a program for emerging critics run by the Architectural League and Urban Design Forum, and it was established in honor of Michael Sorkin, a really, kind of groundbreaking critic of his on his own terms. But I think for everyone who was, we had this advisory board. We were trying to shape the program and figure out how to run it, how to format it, how to what makes a critic, and kind of breaking that down in a way, because so few of us have had the absolute privilege of going, for example, to SVA and understanding it as a process broken down. We were like, how do we take people who have jobs, who have other careers, who want to become writers, how do we make this into a productive time? And so it's really, basically a fellowship program that has selected kind of a cohort of very different people and usually very underrepresented people in criticism. We review like hundreds of applications and read through a lot of essays. And I think the thing that we've really looked for is finding the voices and the people who have very distinct perspectives, either because they're really embedded in that kind of experience or community or research, or that they've been doing the work for a while and really just need like a little bit of support to get their project into publication. And I think as someone who, myself, I was in a fellowship program when I began in journalism at the Asian American Writers Workshop. I was an Open City Fellow, and I really benefited from the experience of having a cohort of peers, of meeting with editors and agents and so on. So I think, every time I've done it, I found it really gratifying because there are, I think it's very easy to say that architectural criticism is dead or something, very dramatic. But when I do that work of looking and sifting through hundreds of applications, I'm like, well, no, it's actually very much alive, and we have to, support people in the process of getting there.
Yeah, I've been like, I think the great thing about New City Critics is that it's a cohort and it feels like a team effort, like a group project, even though we're individually writing our own pieces, and sometimes we write about the same space, sometimes different spaces, but the diversity in our backgrounds and our lived experiences is really great. I mean, even within New York City, my mind has been opened to like just the neighborhood I lived next to for 8 years, but I didn't think about it in this way, and it's just within the cohort. I think what Jung was saying about the meeting with editors, my sense is that there's a world of publishing and writing that was very opaque to me beforehand, and I didn't know how to access it beforehand, and it's opaque for everyone kind of outside of it, and maybe outside of these, and I think New City Critics is very generous in kind of opening up this world to our perspectives and being open to, most of us are not writers actually, or not like writers in that sense. So it's very generous to invite our perspectives into this kind of world.
And Sammy, that sort of circling back to what you said about bringing non-architectural writers into the fold, can you expand on that process, and also just your work representing the 5 boroughs and sort of New York City in a larger sense?
Sure. I mean, maybe I can add something to my previous response, which is, I guess one glaring absence, if you leaf through the publication, is that there are no photographs. So an architecture publication without photographs is oxymoronic in a kind of gleeful way. And I think the reason for that, it was a calculation on our part, but it was, especially when you're kind of saddled with the word, if you're trying to reach a general audience, as we are, and as Curbed is, having a kind of chewy word like architecture in your masthead isn't particularly helpful in cultivating a wide readership. So we counteracted that by basically adopting a mascot and only deciding to publish illustrations and having identifiable bylines from writers who write for all the New York small magazines or New York Magazine. And so that's the first way we did, I think, we were kind of feeling our way out of this kind of trade context into something that was a bit wider in scope, and also varying in degrees of expertise. The other part of that, so if we're looking at the Masthead New York Review of Architecture, I just talked about architecture, but New York is similarly a kind of constructive parameter that we set for ourselves, because New York can be, on its own terms, a very parochial way of seeing the world. And I think part of the challenge is leaning into that, and then part of it is leaning out, and they're both challenging in their own ways. I think we've also had the fortune of being a publication in residence at Decrit at SVA for 3 years running. So part of this is also a mentorship of the kind that New City Critics is doing as well, coming into contact with aspiring critics and writers and reporters who are kind of at transition points in their career sometimes, and definitely come from diverse backgrounds. So we're involved in that work. I think geographically also, New York does not just mean Manhattan or North Brooklyn, and I feel like I can say that because I've lived in Central Queens for 10 years, or for 12 years. And I think it's important for me to get more exposure for Queens, but also for the Bronx and the five boroughs, just trying to be more honest to the fact that as small as architecture is, media is similarly as small, and it feels being inculcated in both contexts. New York actually ends up being feeling like a very small place when the opposite is true.
And Molly, maybe you can weigh in on expanding design research at SVA and sort of widening the types of people you see there.
Oh, yeah, well, yeah, we have a wide embrace, starting with how we define design, and very, intentionally so, we define, for our purposes, we define design as anything human-made intended to serve a function. So that kind of, throws open the gates to pretty much any subject that a student might want to bring to the table for study, which is, it's exciting, and also leads us to, draw in MA candidates who are coming from a variety of design fields. So there's people who have studied architecture maybe, but also sitting beside somebody who has a degree in fashion design, sitting beside somebody who has a background in graphic design, sitting beside somebody who's an art historian. So we actually try to cultivate that mix because we feel like it actually creates much more interesting conversations around the seminar table. But that extends to what the students produce, as they're from the assignments they work on in class to the individual thesis project that they work on. And there's such a great diversity, as Sammy can attest to, as he has been part of editing our students' annual kind of graduation publications, that it's kind of mind-boggling, but also I think very exciting to be able to kind of take away the barriers and take away the silos. And I think with regard to architects specifically, I think of course architects like to talk to other architects about what they're doing and their work, and I think it's really wonderful when architects can really start talking to bigger audiences, and I think it's important for architects to talk to those wider audiences as well, in terms of like kind of a public service to just educate the public more about the built environment specifically. And it's like Florian Eidenberg from SOIL had a nice piece about corrugation in the Brooklyn Rail like last week, and it was kind of unexpected to see. And it's great when you have an architect showing up on the op-ed pages, for example. So I really I love it when we as people who are operating in the architecture and design space can really be connecting with these broader general audiences, and that's certainly what we try to do at Decrit too, and we make it a welcoming and safe space for people trying to experiment with those kinds of connections.
I think something that's come up in preparing for this panel and also this recent issue of Oculus is this idea that I think people often think of criticism as addressing only new things or new work. And I think something you're all doing in your work is looking at existing spaces and emphasizing care and attention to those spaces in different ways. Philip, you had a piece in Untapped in November that I think really gets to that, the root of that discussion. Would you talk a little bit about that? And we have your slides too, I think.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I think I just really appreciate the expansiveness of kind of inviting architects, non-architects to talk about spaces. And I think this is especially true in Chinatown, where there's just so much that's already there. And I think an architect has something to say about the zoning or about the streetscape, but anyone can kind of walk around the neighborhood and see something. And part of my hope for the Untapped piece was to invite everyone to just look at spaces and things that are just already there, and maybe not intentionally kind of designed to be critiqued, but including interactions, kind of moments on the street, and that this is also architectural, deeply architectural in its own way also, too. And yeah, just kind of my own amateur photography. But yeah, it was just to think about, to invite people to think carefully about the way that aesthetics and the way people use spaces matters, and there's a reason for it, and it should be considered in Chinatown and beyond.
I think you were paraphrasing a nice line in the piece about creating a new idea for an existing object. And I think that's a really
yeah.
nice
I was trying to, or part of the piece was trying to like borrow the idea of the ready-made to apply it to all of these, the awnings, the plates, the interactions within the area, and to just say like, this is something that we should pay attention to. And I would say it's like far more interesting than a banana duct taped to a wall is, the awning at Kiki's, right? There's like so much embedded in there, and what it says about where we are today, where we are in this political, social moment, that this is kind of what exists now in this area.
I was just going to add one quick note that Philip's great piece about the idea of the ready-made brought to mind the writer Rob Walker, who is at primarily a Fast Company, but also teaches in our summer intensive and runs a workshop called Overlooked and Underappreciated, which is precisely about what you were talking about. And I think what's so exciting and what the students and I talk about a lot is like design will never let you down. There's always a story embedded wherever you look, and whether you look at something kind of at an individual scale and just ask basic questions start asking questions that lead to questions that lead to questions, like who made this, what's it made of, where did it come from, who commissioned it, who got paid to do this or not. Those are great, and then being able to like layer it into a bigger context, is, you could, there's just so many stories like waiting to be kind of tapped into.
And I'm wondering at Curbed and at Naira, are there intentional conversations about covering existing or aging or work that's not brand new?
Yeah, sure. I think I have a slide as well. Oh, yes. Let's see if it's there. Yeah. Actually, the next one. This was a different project, and another one. I skipped this one, and then. Okay, yeah, this is great. Yeah. I guess I wanted to use, I'm very visuals dependent myself, but there was a project I wanted to use to talk about the way I think really in terms of criticism, like looking at post-occupancy, looking at how buildings are actually lived in and used is really not done as much. And one type of building, structure in New York City that I think most people tend to overlook is NYCHA and public housing. I think the dominant script of NYCHA is that it's perennially underfunded and that that there will not be new investment, that money doesn't grow on trees, and therefore I think the repair and maintenance of NYCHA is also very incredibly incremental. It could take a year to fix a boiler, and so on. So our critic, Justin Davidson, worked with Peterson Rich Office, a firm that has worked on other NYCHA projects with the city, to actually take an existing NYCHA complex that is not currently under any new privatization or other plan, to actually reimagine, what it would be like, what it would look like to, activate it on the street level, to take the money from retail and residential housing to actually invest it back into the building, and to really do a gut renovation of its mechanical systems. And so if you go to the next slide as well, the idea is that there is a level of connection that might be fostered with the street and with the community, that there would be indoor plazas, that there would just be just less of this isolated castle, castle on the garden kind of feeling, and that there would be more interaction. And then the last slide, so this is a long list of things. But I mean, essentially, this is another one of our generative projects where we try to look at what if, the money that is in existing private and new maintenance programs could actually be reinvested back into NYCHA in a more meaningful way, so it isn't just tinkering at the edges of making it better. And then one more quick project. This is a church that I think was basically slated for, it's a landmark church that has a very dwindling congregation and no money for repairs either. And I think the main question on the table was, should we demolish it or just let time take it slowly? And so again, Justin did work with DXA to imagine a way to preserve it, not just the outer shell, and also to generate ways to get income and actually reinvest back into the building and so on. So I think looking at problems and asking different questions about them is actually a really great role that critics can take to get out of the binary of destroy or keep, and so on.
Yeah, in terms of timeliness, I'm a big fan of the late review. So reviewing something that is, definitely not pegged to the news cycle whatsoever. But I think if there's anyone who can take advantage of that, it's a small magazine, because all we have is time. I think to go back to, yeah, I guess maybe to call out a few columns in the magazine. I think in that spirit, we have a column called Address a Building that does something similar, like what Philip was saying and also Molly was saying, which is kind of re-exploring tread ground, searching for the afterlives of buildings, finding a building wherever, and if it's interesting or not, whether it's heroic or not, even in the past, trying to find the redemptive moment in an existing object, or existing building, existing environment, which naturally leads me to Penn Station. We've had many heroically contrarian cases that the critic Thomas DeMonchaux has made on our behalf for the preservation and alteration, adaptation of the existing Penn Station and Madison Square Garden complex. Recently, we also had a piece that made a case for Port Authority. It's, I guess, a sister complex. Yeah, these places are, maligned to the point of banality, and they are extremely interesting places to be in, unpleasurable for sure, but lots of other things that are going on, and trying to focus the reader on those moments, or how to identify those moments in an unfamiliar or familiar environment is one of our tasks. Again, to go back to like having a general reader as our target audience, I think there's a two-pronged approach, or I guess aim, which is to kind of meet the reader where they are, regardless of expertise, cultivate them to have an appreciation, or kind of invite them to cultivate an appreciation for the merits of design specialization, while at the same time informing them of ways to curb the excesses of that specialization. So whenever, let's say, the politics of the wrecking ball, which happens to be another column rubric of ours, where we invite writers to rhetorically demolish a proposed development, an existing building, a policy shibboleth, a well-loved book. All of these things, I think, these are different entry points into the publication, but I think just as a practice, I think just trying to meet people where they're at, while also giving them the tools to, one, take things more slowly and take clear, sharper focus on what's around them, but also to better understand the politics of everything that goes into a building.
Something that came up on our preparation call was, Philip, you brought it up, this idea of sort of a misunderstandings that can occur between activists or critics and around architecture and the codes and just the nitty-gritty of operating in the city that building professionals confront. I'm wondering what, if anything, could be done to sort of assuage or improve this sort of understanding of these factors when people get up in arms about a project kind of ahead of themselves.
Yeah, I think that's or what Sammy was saying about giving the general public, tools to kind of not just understand everything around the built environment around them, but to kind of act. I think this is where architects should exercise their expertise. And architects are the ones who know the zoning code, the building code. Architects know why things are the way they are. Architects know the way the city works, the incentives of the city. Architects know the pressures of the client and how the client is thinking about their project and what the client thinks their project is doing. So I think architects can exercise their expertise as this bridge between these worlds that may be totally inaccessible to the normal New Yorker, and the normal New Yorker who lives in the city and who works in the city, and who just like, architects have that knowledge that can bridge those two worlds and can kind of be that toolkit, or be at least an educator, or be themselves engaged in kind of bridging those worlds through, yeah. I guess I think there are several ways that architects can do this. I truly believe that exhibitions and publications are just as much architectural as like a building or a sketch or a rendering. They're about the execution of an idea, and architects can very easily publish something on their website, or exhibit something in one of their spaces. And this can be a way to kind of actually engage beyond just, let's just say, like constructing a finished building.
And Molly, in your work, what sort of relationships are you hoping to foster between, for instance, the students and the architecture community?
Yes, good question. I mean, I think we do have our students. They are certainly not sequestered in an ivory tower by any means while they're with us, and we actually have them out pounding the pavement to do interviews and do research all along the way. And so one, I think, really great class that they are able to have in the fall semester when they first begin is with Carrie Jacobs, who's an architecture writer and critic, whose byline probably a lot of you know. But she teaches a class where she essentially takes students around town. They are very rarely in the studio for more than like an hour at a time with her, and she takes them into architecture firms. They talk to people, the architects working on projects. They go on site visits with the architects or with artists, and so they are, by doing that, I think, learning how to make their own firsthand observations in those settings, but also just to talk to architects if they're not themselves architects. And I think that can be a bit of a barrier for writing about architecture, or people, like as Sammy was saying, people who are great writers but not necessarily don't have a background in architecture, because it is a technical art in some ways, and but there are key things that can be ascertained and learned, and you can even as a non-architect think about where you stand in terms of like using architecture, and you have perfect credibility to be able to write about architecture, even if you're not an architect, because you're using architecture all the time, every day. So I think we try to instill a bit of a sense of fearlessness in our students as much as we can, and I think there are quite a few students that come through the program who are very interested and passionate about the built environment and wanting to think about architecture, but in pretty big ways. So we had a student, for example, who wrote her thesis that was essentially a kind of critical look at these from scratch cities that are in the works around the world, often funded by tech billionaires or kingdoms with endless coffers, or like a student who is interested in looking at public space and who's welcome in it or not. And so I think our students are very anxious and think that architecture and the built environment and landscape architecture too are very exciting kind of territories to engage with.
Not to put you on the spot, but Sammy's made the comment about sort of avoiding the PR machines and the impulse to react to every press release we get. And speaking for myself, that's sometimes hundreds a day, really. And so I'm wondering what your habits and systems are around like filtering information, sort of engaging with architects and practitioners in a meaningful way on your own terms.
Do you want to take it, or should I? Okay, so I think at Curbed, I think both the critic, our architecture critic, his editor, myself, we do field a lot of PR, and I think generally we're, I would say we have a lot of resistance to covering something just because it's done by a major firm, and generally we try to have a discussion about it, and I think generally we've landed on a protocol where if there's nothing interesting to say about something, we just don't write about it. I think if there's a critique where there's something which has been celebrated, which kind of deserves like a public dialogue around, then we do publish something. But there are definitely times when we see something and maybe everyone is flocking to write about it, and our critic is gone, and I've gone, and the editor is gone, and we all just feel like it's just perfectly fine. And so, and what I think is harder to do, but that we do wish we could do more, is find the practices that are doing something smaller scale, or kind of intervening within something larger, like they're building like a clinic within a practice, or they're doing something that's maybe not in New York City, But that is definitely harder to find, that kind of like to do that kind of scouting all the time. And I think I do read all the architecture publications as well to see who's writing, where are they traveling, where are they based. But it is hard because I feel like PR does dominate what gets published in most of the field. And so it's a lot of sifting and like kind of filtering for your inner sense of, is this really something exciting, or is this just trying to get me excited, or is this rendering just really nice? We do have a column we call Rendering Judgment, where we try to take apart the rendering. So we try not to fall into it and say, okay, what is this really showing us? Like, is this a real new Port Authority, or is it more of the same with some glass curtain walls or something? So, but yeah, I think it is an ongoing thing, and I do feel like for the younger, newer practices who don't have a PR representative, it's just much harder, because then it's really about networks and who you know, and do they feel bold enough to share what they're working on.
Yeah, I think it really falls to the discretion, my discretion, and the discretion of my co-editor, Chloe Wyma. But it does make our job a lot more difficult. We're already kind of strapped as it is. There's two of us, and then 2 people on the publishing side, and that makes 4. And we're doing a lot of different things, including mentorship and events. So by kind of receding from the buzz, there are consequences to that, and there are many times where I've found myself desperate for something to fill a hole in an issue, and I want to just say yes to something that's new and buzzy. And I think that's something I felt, the entire, the last decade when I was in design publishing, or trade publishing, where it is so easy, the temptation to just kind of fill the gap, choose the most expeditious route because it's already there. And I think we kind of built these constraints into our model because, not to be, I don't want to rail or direct too much criticism towards, public relations, but I think one of the reasons, again, that we don't have photographs is that it's the same reason that the photographs and then the architect's statement and project and developer statement, they all come to you very seamlessly in one folder. And so if we're going to say no to the photographs, we should also say no to the project statements, but also say no to the projects, or at least take our time and go visit those places and wait, take a beat, and wait 6 months, or wait till the drywall has dried. And maybe revisit it in a couple years' time. The other kind of parameters we put up, I think, is really learning to listen more to writers and to pitches. And I think scanning pitches for repetitious language is one thing, because I've been doing this so long that a couple, certain phrasing carries over from context to context. So I've developed a kind of a way to filter pitches that I think were maybe one step removed from the PR circuit, but not enough for me. And it's also like just inviting writers to just really develop pitches over time. So even if there's something a little, trying to find the germ of idea in the initial pitch email and then trying to develop it from there. Sometimes that means a lot of conversation. Sometimes that just means a lot of emails. Sometimes it means rereading The Power Broker just to edit a piece about it. So yes, I think we're all, it's a pretty time-consuming and arduous process, and it's kind of a self-selected torture to a certain extent. But I think it's all for a good cause, maybe.
Maybe writers and architects have the self-selecting torture thing in common, right? I know I'm just looking at the time, and I wanted to have a couple minutes for questions, if anyone has them. But first, I was hoping to end on a fun note and ask if anybody has a favorite piece of criticism to share from recent memory?
So from the last year, I guess I'll give two, you know, not to split my loyalties to these writers, or to split them rather. One is a piece called Fifth Column that was about Wegmans opening at Union Square, and we published it last March. And it's the author, Thomas DeMoncho, managed to trace a lineage from the Bronze Age to Wegmans via Tony Soprano, and the aesthetics, the kind of bourgeois aesthetics of Tuscany and Italianate, which have particular resonance in a city like New York. So how he did this by identifying the Tuscan column as the primary repository of meaning through the ages. So that was fun. It got me to go to Wegmans for the first time in my life. So there's that. The second one was it's called Avant-Garde, which was again a kind of late. Talk about coming at the end of a life cycle of a design. It was a 7,000 word essay by Aaron Timms about Sunnyside Yards and the 2020 mega plan that was announced as in the dying days of Bill de Blasio's mayorship and right before COVID. And the plan itself is, at the point of publishing was last summer. It was about 4 years out of date, but still using that plan as a guide to understanding the area or its potential, but also walking. I think I joined him on some tours and others not, but I think he clocked a lot of steps just going around Sunnyside Yard and the surrounding areas in Queens, in Sunnyside, Long Island City, Astoria. And then from that was able to build a kind of a play for speculative criticism, while also looking at migration patterns in Queens. And towards the end, he kind of identifies different hotels that have popped up in the last few years to take advantage of the credit for housing migrants, which are all going away at the moment. So I would say, yeah, those two pieces, Avant-Garde and Fifth Column, both very funny. I think humor is, if you were to read it Naira at all, humor would be the first thing that popped into your mind and you take away from it. But also very serious, not deathly serious, but serious.
I think it's forward. Yeah. One more. Oh, yeah, sure. So this is actually like a kind of, I have it here because I think of it as, it's not purely architectural criticism, but basically I went to this writer with a question about 75 East Broadway, which Philip has also written about. And it's this mini mall that has a very upstairs, downstairs dynamic. Upstairs is James Valoria, it's thrift shops, mid-century design shops, art galleries. It was home to a very, very cool music store and so on. And downstairs is a lot of, some counterfeit shops, some cosmetic shops, more from and for the Chinese American community that's been there for a while. And I went and I asked him, can you just look into this, explain this for me? And what he did was actually something very different. He knew that the mall across the street, 88 East Broadway, which is sometimes used for raves and after parties, but is largely vacant. He wanted to know, why is 75 flourishing in this bifurcated way, while 88 East Broadway, which used to be like the heart of the Chinatown community, why is it almost completely empty? And so when he did that research, he was able to unearth things about the tax agreements and the real estate agreements that these two owners had made, decades and decades ago, and how it was all kind of coming to light now. If the 75 was at this percentage and then they owe this much rent, 88 had, I think, 8 times more of a tax burden and a rent burden. And so it was very, like, in a way cut and dry, but it was also really illuminating because there are two mini malls that are across the street from each other with basically a very similar format and a very similar kind of audience and community they were reaching out to. So I really appreciated that he went in this completely different direction. I was like, who cares? 88 East Broadway. And he was like, no, you don't understand. This is where everybody went for their weddings and their funerals and their retirement parties. And 75 was nothing. So I was like, oh, okay. So I think that's where I think having, you know, different voices, having people do the research, and having people look at power and like who's paying for what is actually very illuminating. So even though it wasn't like critiquing the buildings as, you know, maybe in terms of their built form, it was very much like a kind of illuminating the, you know, what was underneath the surface, and I appreciated that.
I didn't have one prepared, but actually when I'm thinking about this, I was going to bring up this article. It's totally, because I've read this article many times. I loved it because it's not architectural, but it is, because he interviewed the record store owner, he interviewed people on the second floor, or he interviewed people on the first floor, asked people on the first floor what they thought about people on the second floor, and that's what architecture is, and how people are using this building, how this building has changed, combined with all the kind of factors behind the scenes that kind of made it what it is, but plus all the cultural, aesthetics, softer things that have transformed the building to what it's become.
And Molly, do you have a piece of student work you want to highlight?
Let me invoke a couple of students. The projects I have in mind are from the class of 2024, and say architecture adjacent at least, but both like really interesting, and both of these students really just kind of went for it in terms of bringing a kind of critical eye and perspective. But the first one I'll mention is by Olivia Trabish, and her thesis title is The Eyes of Texas, Interstate Surveillance and Bodily Autonomy in Amarillo. And it was essentially about how it was about the, in part, development of the interstate highway system under Eisenhower, and particularly in that area of Texas around Amarillo, and the growth of the military-industrial complex, but how that very same highway system is now being used for surveillance related to rollbacks of abortion rights. And it was a very profound piece of analysis based on research. She comes from Amarillo, and it was a really fantastic thesis that I think is quite important, and you can read an excerpt of it on our Medium page. And then another project, really different, but kind of, I think, equally powerful in its own way, was by A.J. Kushner, and he wrote a thesis paper called The Rights at Manitoga, Reverse Queering American Modernity. And some of you may have been to Russell and Mary Wright's house called Manitoga, and just upstate in Ghent, New York. And they also have published a book that you may have heard of called The Guide to Easier Living that came out in the 50s. And sort of, a very, a book that's very much associated with like the, like 50s modern lifestyle. But AJ dug into the archives and really uncovered some really interesting things about the rights, that they were really, for their time, quite radical, kind of free spirits who lived in a kind of commune before they got married. And then Russell Wright went on after Mary's death to have a relationship with a man, and who'll continue to live on the property. But it was an interesting study because it was really, it wasn't that no one knew this information, but it had not gotten a spotlight at all. And so AJ was able to shine much more of a spotlight on it, and as part of his archival research, went back to the original manuscript of the Guide to Easier Living, and found some things that had not made it into the published book that related to gender norms and roles. And so I think it was a really valuable piece of research that was historic in nature, but also like very relevant to today, and just put a whole new kind of lens on this particular property and couple and history.
And we're lucky to have AJ as a contributor now to Oculus, so we're thankful for that. Before we thank our panelists, I think we have time for one or two questions from the audience, if you're up for it. Does anybody have a question? We'll go, and then you next.
Thanks for the great panel. It's been so nice to see all these people here. I wondered, we talked about trade publications a bit. I wanted to defend trade publications a little bit, having worked on one for a while, but I think they do have like a way of supporting some of this type of long form, critical writing, and I guess and their model obviously is very scrappy and creative, as the advertising industry has basically collapsed. So they have some of that, and then they have some of these like new models for advertising and generating, income that basically subsidizes a magazine, right? And so I wondered if you guys could, follow the money a little bit and kind of talk a bit about some models of supporting this type of writing, because it's like really difficult to support 7,000 words on Sunnyside Yards, or supporting Justin Davidson as a full-time critic, like, or starting out as a writer too. Like, I don't know how many full-time critics there even are. So I just wondered like what some of the creative ways of funding publications or funding yourselves as writers or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I acknowledge the point. Trade publishing is, treated as a piñata in the course of this conversation. But I agree. There is a defense to be made, obviously, for trade publication. One of my favorite trade publications is an amalgam of 10, 15 trade publications that can be found at US Modernist, which is a huge repository of archived publications like Record, Architectural Forum, Progressive Architecture, all publications that had really the wind to their back when they were operating for sometimes as many decades as 70 years, 80 years. And then the advertising fell beneath them. It just dropped to the floor. And the similar thing happened around the 2008 crisis. And so the advertising model changed. It became, it was always a little bit pay to play, but it became even more so. But if you look at and I've done this many, many times, if you look through that archive, it's amazing what those magazines were able to do when they did it, how they were able to capture the kind of spirit of the moment and also the momentum of practice at any given time. And I think that is just because there are numerous factors at play, but architecture also enjoyed a different cultural standing in that moment. And it was taken for granted that architecture could be discussed on the same level with the same intelligibility and interest as music or film or visual art. And I think, for good and ill, we can't take that for granted anymore. And I think on my end, I think it's been important for me to kind of build that up. So architecture, however just, kind of squirrely defined, can be brought up into conversations of other forms of culture in a way that doesn't feel forced, but feels earned. And I guess in the terms of like publishing and supporting a project, it is very difficult. The way we're subscriber only. We split our revenue. I think majority of it is through subscriptions, direct subscriptions, and I hope everyone in this room will subscribe. And the other half, or a little less, is through grants and sponsor money. And that's how we've been kind of able to cobble together a project. We've also tried to do our due diligence. We've worked with the Freelancers Writers Union to ensure that there's, transparency in rates and editorial processes when we reach out to a writer and work with them. We're also a workers' cooperative of 6 now, which is an interesting and a kind of hopeful trajectory of independent publishing that you may associate with Defector or Hellgate. And I think what that, it's not for everyone, but and it did take a long time for us to convert what was essentially kind of a nonprofit to a workers' co-op. But what it does do, it ensures that accountability is diffused across the entirety of the organization. It also builds excitement about a project, both in-house and outside of it. And I think readers do, and they have treated us very charitably, even when, speaking for myself, maybe I don't deserve it, but I think they are very excited, and they react just as excitedly when it's not just a magazine, it's not just words and illustrations on a page, but it's also a network, it's a workers' co-op, an organization, a pro-labor organization, but it's also a forum for writers of all kinds to meet at parties that we have, or events such as this.
Thank you, and I think we've all benefited from the conversations that have sort of come out of some of these new models of funding publications, like continuing education, especially here at the center, and other publication-sponsored educational events like Record has, and actually a lot of the publications. So it's great to know about some of these newer models. One more question, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thank you so much from everyone. It was such an interesting panel and discussion. I got very excited to see the topic because I did my PhD in architecture criticism. I'm from Australia. I'm practicing now, but I have published few papers in architecture criticism, and I'm a big fan of this topic. My question, and perhaps not really a question, but a matter of discussion, is about positivity and conservatism in architecture criticism. Because it is there, I think one of the reasons, and also I would like to link back to the whole idea of if architecture criticism is dead. And I suppose, that's a very good question, and it shouldn't be, because I think it just needs some fire, which is lacking at the moment, because a lot of practitioners are not trained to write critically, and I think that's something that's really important. And I just bring an example of myself working as a consultant with a firm, an awarded firm, and just reflecting on my experience of their work. And they criticized me for critiquing the work and the project, because it was a matter of the IP of the project, and the architects, as well as there's also the discussion of, does that person want to harm our reputation, which is never the case. And I was actually I was trying to be very professional and be very objective. So I think one of the questions that I have, and perhaps a topic that I would like to just bring in, and just also offer to be more practiced by architecture students, because I used to teach as well, architecture students and practitioners, that how important it is to teach them to write critically in architecture, because it's very helpful for defending their works, but also be having this awareness that if the principal or your manager is asking you to do this and that in the process, where do you think it's going to? What is the outcome? Is it going to be inhabitable space? Or I think just self-critique of the process. So my question is, I guess number one, where do you see, how do you think this habit of being positive or being conservative about stepping a little inside maybe you shouldn't have done this because it has caused this type of issue, challenge in the inhabitation of the place. But how do you see that? Do you think that's something that's practiced? And how do you think the whole issue of IP is in the way of being more perhaps critical in a constructive way?
We need another panel for this question. Yeah.
Well, I'll take a shot. I mean, I probably, like a lot of us here, think often of Michael Sorkin and just bringing the fire to to speak truth to power and to any piece you write. And Sammy, you got to work with him, and I got to work with him a little bit as well. And the real deal, and we certainly miss him a lot. But and I think his "Save the Whitney" piece from the Village Voice, 1985, is one of my favorite pieces of criticism of all time. So go read it if you haven't. But it is a fraught environment. In terms of litigation and people, if you're publishing something that is critical. But I don't know. I mean, in our program, we try to get students to exercise that muscle as much as possible. But it's scary, and so like I said, we try to create a safe space where they can do that. And I think sometimes it's almost like it's like sometimes when you're wearing headphones and you're talking too loud. People have to kind of figure out their own voice and modulate it, so it's their own. And I think that's the most important thing, is that you're, being true to yourself as a writer. But there's just unfortunately not as many opportunities as there might have been to do that in a more kind of public forum. The Village Voice is no more, and fortunately, there's Naira and Justin Davidson still with us. But I do love the idea of an in-house critic. I think that could be such a valuable role for architecture firms to cultivate, and have kind of this internal gadfly who does come into a pinup or whatever and be like, hey, this is something you might want to rethink. There's probably internal politics that would go along with that, I can imagine. But I think it would be great. I don't necessarily, having not operated as an architect myself, have advice on how to navigate that side of it. But maybe somebody else on the panel does.
Just quickly, I mean, I do think an in-house critic has become a career track for some former critics, without naming names. And but I think generally, just as an ethos, when I'm trying to explain to architects, the value of writing, or even why the writing that we publish takes, is contoured the way that it is to go for an easy metaphor or analog. No designer writes to a brief. A writer should not be expected to do that either. So you need to build in the flexibility and agility that in the way that you interpret a project or a job. And that means also in your sales pitch, how do you gotta hook people in some way. And I think maybe that's a matter of narrative, and actually finding a way to tell a compelling narrative. It takes structure, but it also takes you've got to take risks when you're doing it. And I think the aversion to risk is structurally embedded in the discipline, because as you're saying, the liability is such a big thing, and it hangs like a sword of Damocles over everything everyone does. And risk also goes to IP. IP isn't, the entire justification for it is that it's risk averse. So, how one solves that, I'm not sure, but I'm sure you could do that in an office by office, case by case basis.
I guess just one point is that it's not just the IP, it's literally the hand that feeds you. And that's the incentive structure here, is that the client pays the architect, and what incentives does the architect have to rock the boat that much? It's a really tricky question, and yeah, there's no kind of answer to this. That's the structural thing.
That's well said. Thank you for the questions and the answers. And on that note, I think we can all agree that there's this is such an important time to engage in interrogating the places we live, the spaces we occupy. Asking these questions, even if we don't know the answers, is the name of the game. So I thank you to the panelists for being here and giving us their time, and I hope we can all read their work, habitually. I think, yes. And reading longer form and very considered work, I find actually therapeutic these days. So thank you to everyone else.